Mary married a very wealthy businessman and felt incredibly fortunate. Out of all the beautiful women her husband knew and had as friends, he chose her to be his bride. Mary had lost her parents in a car crash at a young age. Although she completed junior high school, financial constraints prevented her from continuing to senior high. To survive, she worked as a house help. Mary served in a large household, performing chores and keeping the compound clean. Her discipline and diligence did not go unnoticed by her boss, who saw her potential to handle business errands. On her first assignment, she dressed impeccably to represent her boss's company well before his clients. That fateful day, she was sent to Mr. Bryan. He was immediately struck by her beauty. Her smile could soothe a troubled soul, her English was flawless, and her expressions were polite. Over time, Bryan came to appreciate Mary's industriousness and respectfulness. After a year, they married in a wedding that became the talk of the town. Many other women wished they had been as lucky, but fortune had indeed smiled on Mary. Bryan asked Mary not to work, but to focus on maintaining their home and caring for their expected baby. Initially, Mary was hesitant about the idea, but she remembered her mother's advice. To keep a man, one must respect him. Her mother had always said that submission is a natural spell for binding men to your will. They lived in a grand house that her husband had built, and she had her own car, a gift from him. Mary earned her husband's deep affection by skillfully maintaining peace with her in-laws, even when they tried to provoke her. She made her home welcoming to her in-laws and ensured it was especially comfortable for Maxwell, Bryan's immediate younger brother, who lived with them. Maxwell had graduated from the tertiary institution and decided to learn the business from his elder brother, Bryan. However, he was lazy and greedy, and his attitudes and actions often irritated Mary. Despite this, she had a unique way of maintaining a peaceful environment. Sometimes, Maxwell would rudely ask Mary, "What did my brother see in a girl who only finished junior high school?" Mary would respond with a light-hearted answer. "He saw through the lens of purpose, the inner and priceless beauty of a virtuous woman." When she began to speak poetically, Maxwell would fall silent, unable to compete with her command of language. This was her way of silencing those who tried to intimidate her about her education. She would use all the grammar and idioms she had learned from books to prove that she knew more than those who had gone to school. Occasionally, Maxwell realized he had overstepped his boundaries and would apologize to Mary. She would politely accept his apology and offer him some advice. Mary was 8 months pregnant and not as strong as she used to be. One evening, she sat on the couch in the living room, waiting for her husband's return. It was around 8 p.m., and Bryan was unusually late. What is keeping him? Mary wondered. She reached for her phone and called him. Maxwell answered instead, informing her that Bryan was in the hospital and very sick. "What happened to him?" Mary asked, her voice trembling with fear. "I don't know," Maxwell replied, "but the doctors are doing their best to resuscitate him." "Resuscitate?" Mary exclaimed. "Is he unconscious?" "Yes," Maxwell confirmed. Mary, feeling increasingly worried, asked for the hospital's location so she could see him. "Don't worry," Maxwell said. "Save your strength because of your condition. It's late now. You can see him tomorrow." Despite her insistence, Maxwell refused to disclose the address. Mary ended the call, looking up at the ceiling. "Oh Lord, please save my husband," she prayed. An hour later, Maxwell called again. "How is he doing?" Mary asked anxiously. There was a brief silence before Maxwell said, "He is gone." Mary screamed, dropping the phone. She had forgotten she was pregnant. She cried, but there was no one to console her. In just 2 years of marriage, she was now a widow. Millions of thoughts raced through her mind. She had been an orphan, and now she was a widow. As people began to arrive at her house, her phone buzzed with calls. Each time she answered, she could only cry until the line went dead. She wondered how the world could turn against her just when she thought she had found comfort after losing her parents. People consoled Mary as she began to scream in pain, clutching her stomach. Initially, Everyone thought her pain was due to the emotional trauma of losing her husband. They held her, offering comfort. However, Mary kept shouting, "Take me to the hospital. I am not feeling comfortable." Realizing the urgency, they rushed her to the hospital. After an examination, the doctor revealed that Mary was in premature labor. She was taken to the labor ward and encouraged to push. Despite her efforts, the doctor eventually had to perform an operation to deliver the baby. Mary and her child spent a few weeks in the hospital recovering. During this time, Mary was surprised and hurt that her late husband's family did not visit her in the hospital. They ensured the medical bills were settled, but no one came to see her. Eventually, she was discharged from the hospital. Mary returned home to find her house occupied by her husband's family, who had already set a date for the burial ceremony. She discovered that her in-laws had claimed all access to her husband's bank accounts. The most heartbreaking news came from Maxwell, who told her, "You are allowed to stay here until the burial is over, after which you will have to leave. It is the family's decision." "Where do I go?" Mary asked, her voice trembling. "Anywhere, maybe where you came from," replied the in-laws coldly. Mary cried out in frustration, questioning how people she had been kind to could treat her so cruelly. She lost her appetite and even contemplated suicide, wondering why she hadn't given up in the labor room. Determined to confront her in-laws, Mary gathered her courage and walked back into the main building. She found them laughing and drinking in the living room. Standing in the midst of them in her black expensive apparel, she asked, "What have I done to deserve such cruel treatment?" "You are responsible for the death of your husband," they all echoed. "What?" exclaimed Mary. "Me?" "Yes, you," Maxwell responded. "Barely 2 years after you married our brother, he is dead. What do you want us to believe? Did you see him in the hospital? Did you even know what happened to him?" Mary was shocked by his questions, knowing full well that Maxwell had prevented her from visiting the hospital that night, even when she insisted. It was becoming clear to her. Her mind raced, connecting the dots of Maxwell's actions over the past year. She began to suspect that her in-laws were responsible for her husband's death. "If they can do this to their brother, my life will mean nothing to them," she thought. She returned to her room with her baby, feeling more isolated than ever. From that day on, Mary became extremely cautious, determined to protect her life for the sake of her child. She had no idea where to go or whom to call. After her parents' death, she had worked as a housemaid until she met Brian. She tried to contact her previous employer but was unable to reach them. With no access to her husband's wealth and not even a room to call her own, she felt deep sorrow for her child. After the burial ceremony, Mary anticipated some reaction from her in-laws, who had taken full possession of the house. They neither spoke to her nor interacted with her in any way. She cooked her own meals and kept to herself. 3 months later, she returned home to find her belongings outside. Maxwell met her and said, "You have finished mourning your late husband. You can leave now before I call the police on you. Do you think you can kill your husband to possess his wealth and remain innocent?" Mary began to cry again, pleading with him. "Where will I go?" Mary left the house, wandering the streets with tears streaming down her face, repeatedly asking herself, "Why me?" She found an unfinished building along the way, where she spread her wrappers and laid her child down. She sat there for hours, contemplating how to manage her life and care for her child. When the baby cried, she nursed him. She spent the night there. By the 3rd day, Mary had exhausted all her money. She couldn't fathom how she would survive. The baby cried incessantly from morning until late morning, and she couldn't soothe him. Is he sick? Or could it be the cold, she wondered, feeling utterly confused. In her frustration, she cried out loud, contemplating ending her life and leaving the child to cry until he received help or died crying. In her despair, a man walked in and stood at the entrance, staring at the crying baby. Mary looked up and saw him. "Who are you?" she asked. "The child will not die. He will grow up to be great and judge the wickedness of his household," the man said. "Take this, eat and feed the lad." He handed her a bag and left. Inside the bag, Mary found a loaf of bread and a bottle of water. She ate a portion of the bread, drank the water, and then fed her son. After eating, the boy stopped crying. Mary was surprised and pondered the words of the strange man. "The boy shall be great," she muttered. The next morning, Mary took her son to the street to beg. By noon, she had collected some money. She used it to buy a bag of sachet water and took it to Mr. Frank, pleading with him to help her cool the water in his deep freezer so she could sell it cold. Frank agreed, unable to refuse the request of such a beautiful girl. She also requested a bowl to carry the water on her head. She began hawking the water, selling it all that day and the next. Each night, she returned to the unfinished building to rest, holding on to the hope that her child would not die, as the strange man had assured her. When Victor, Mary's son, turned 6, she knew it was time to make a difficult decision. Faced with the struggle of supporting her family alone, she thought it wise to seek the help of Maxwell, her late husband's brother. With her limited income, enrolling Victor in school seemed impossible. As Mary arrived at her deceased husband's house, she found that Maxwell had taken control of the family properties, distributing some to their other siblings. His initial reaction to her presence was one of anger. He demanded, "What are you looking for in this place?" Humbled, Mary fell to her knees and pleaded, "Please help me take care of your brother's son. He deserves an education, but I can't afford the school fees. If only I could get him enrolled in a primary school." Her heartfelt appeal softened Maxwell's heart, and he eventually agreed to help. Maxwell was now married to Tina, and as he introduced Mary to her, he made sure Tina understood who she was, a widow of his late brother. Mary expressed her gratitude before taking her leave. Victor, wise and respectful beyond his years, soon formed a bond with Precious, Maxwell's son. Thanks to his uncle's generosity, Victor was enrolled in a government primary school, opening the door to a brighter future. Tina treated Victor poorly, subjecting him to constant maltreatment. One day, she sent Victor to purchase eggs from a nearby store. As he returned home carrying the eggs in a nylon bag, he entered the house. Precious, who had been hiding behind the entrance door, suddenly jumped out to scare Victor as a playful prank. Startled, Victor dropped the eggs, which shattered upon hitting the ground. Tina, who had been waiting in the kitchen for the eggs, emerged to find the broken shells scattered across the floor. Enraged, she seized Victor and beat him mercilessly, hurling abusive names at him and blaming his supposed worthlessness on his mother. Despite Victor's tearful attempts to explain that he was not at fault for the broken eggs, Tina ignored his pleas, intent on punishing him. This incident was not isolated. Day after day, Tina found reasons to beat Victor and deprive him of food. She forced him to wash dishes after meals, sweep the house, and scrub every toilet, subjecting him to relentless chores and harsh treatment. One day, as Victor was returning from school with his classmates, he confided in them about his fear of going home. When they asked why, he revealed the cruelty of his aunt and the relentless maltreatment he endured. Fed up with the abuse, Victor admitted he was considering running away. One of his friends asked where he would go, but Victor had no answer. His friend then suggested that instead of running away, they should teach his aunt a lesson. Curious, Victor asked how. His friend whispered a plan into his ear. Victor gasped, finding the idea too harsh. "Yes," his friend insisted. "That's the way to stop her from harming you. Give it a try before she does more damage." Reluctantly, Victor agreed. His classmate took him to his house, and together they went to the backyard to cut a particular leaf. Victor took the leaf home, feeling a newfound sense of confidence. As Victor opened the door to the sitting room, he saw his Aunt Tina sitting on the couch, waiting for him. "Why are you late from school?" she demanded. Victor stood speechless, unable to lie as his mother had always warned him against it. He knew he would face another round of beating, regardless of his reason for being late. Resigned to his fate, he braced himself. As expected, Tina pounced on him, delivering the usual beating. However, this time, Victor cried only a little before stopping. It was a Friday, and Tina assigned him the task of washing her clothes that night, as she needed them for the next day. Victor gladly took the clothes to the laundry machine and washed them, thinking that Sunday would be the perfect day to execute his plan. On Sunday morning, Victor went into his aunt's room to clean the toilet, as was his usual duty. Maxwell was in the sitting room. The plan was to rub the leaves he had plucked on Tina's dress. As he entered the room, his eyes scanned for the clothes she would wear, but he found none. "How do I know which one she'll wear?" he thought. He entered the washroom and scrubbed the floor while Tina lay in bed, scrolling through her phone. Victor's mind raced, searching for a strategy to get her out of the room so he could carry out his plan. He had been in the room longer than expected when Tina called out, asking what was taking him so long. He replied that he was done and was about to leave. As he reached the parlor, Maxwell called him. "Victor," Maxwell said. "Yes, sir," Victor replied. "Call your aunt." Victor dashed to her wardrobe and rubbed all the clothes on the hangers with the leaves, unsure which one she would wear to church that day. He quickly left the room. Maxwell then told Tina to prepare for service, as they were running late. They all got into their large SUV, with Maxwell at the wheel. On the way, Tina began to lightly scratch her body, thinking it was just a minor irritation. However, the itching soon spread to other parts of her body. Despite this, Maxwell and Tina continued their conversation, with Tina still believing it was nothing serious. When they arrived at the church, they took their reserved seats at the front, as they were among the church's major financiers and were highly respected for their financial contributions. However, that day took an unexpected turn. Tina's itching intensified, and she began to scratch herself vigorously, moving restlessly in her seat. Maxwell was taken aback by his wife's unusual behavior. "Why are you scratching like this?" he asked. "I don't know, it started in the car," Tina replied. As the service continued, Tina's scratching became more frantic, and she struggled to control it. The congregation watched in surprise as Tina's discomfort turned into a dramatic scene. Maxwell, concerned, took her by the hand and led her outside. The pastor also came to see what was happening. "Please help me," Tina cried out, scratching furiously. "Take me to the hospital," she pleaded. Maxwell quickly ushered her into the car, taking the two boys along, and drove off to the hospital. The doctors tried to take a sample from Tina, but her continuous scratching made it impossible. They also attempted to administer a drip, but to no avail. Eventually, they gave her a sedative injection. While she was asleep, they took a blood sample to run some tests and administered a drip to calm the itching. The test results showed nothing was wrong with her. When Tina woke up, she began scratching and crying again. The doctors then suggested removing her dress. Once they did, the itching gradually stopped. It was clear that the dress had been the cause all along. Maxwell immediately discarded the dress and went out to buy a new one for her. They then returned home where Tina, feeling exhausted, rested. That day, Victor experienced peace at home. No beatings, no errands, and no abusive words. Everything seemed normal, and no one suspected anything because the boys were too young to be considered capable of such actions. However, whenever Tina wore any clothes from that wardrobe, the itching would start again until she removed them. One day, Precious and Victor were discussing in their room when Precious asked what might be causing his mother's affliction. Victor suggested that it might be divine retribution for the way Tina had been treating him. Precious relayed this to his mother, which made Tina furious. She demanded to see Victor immediately. When Victor arrived, Tina unleashed a torrent of curses, extending them to his mother, and ordered him out of her sight. Convinced that the clothes were the cause of her itching, Tina decided to replace all her wardrobe items. A week after Tina's itching ordeal, a disaster struck Maxwell's office. The jewelry business he had inherited from his late brother, Brian, who was married to Mary, faced a crisis. A piece of gold worth 50 million naira had gone missing. Maxwell questioned all his staff about the missing gold, but everyone denied any knowledge of its disappearance. He pleaded with them to come forward, but no one did. He even resorted to threats, but still no one confessed. Desperate to uncover the truth, Maxwell made a decision that would reveal the grand secret. Maxwell reported the missing gold to the police. That afternoon, police officers arrived at the shop in their mobile vehicles. One inspector, dressed in plain clothes, stepped out of the car, accompanied by two uniformed officers armed with firearms. The staff became visibly nervous. The customers were asked to leave for a period of 1 to 2 hours, depending on the situation. Once the customers had exited, the staff were called in for questioning one by one. While the uniformed officers conducted the interrogations, the inspector requested to see the CCTV system. Maxwell led the inspector to his office, where the computer monitoring the entire office was kept. The inspector asked if any hard disks had been changed in the past 7 years. Maxwell admitted that 3 disks had been replaced. The inspector requested to see them, and Maxwell brought out the disks. The inspector played them in fast-forward mode, asking Maxwell to identify the people in the footage. Brian, the original CEO of the firm, was identified. Hours passed, and suddenly the inspector noticed something unusual. He stopped the video and played it at normal speed. The footage showed an event before Brian's death. Maxwell entered his office, opened the refrigerator, and took out a bottle of juice. He poured some substances into the juice, shook it well, and then took it to his brother Brian. A few minutes after drinking the juice, Brian began to cough and spit out blood. Maxwell rushed him out. As the inspector replayed the footage, Maxwell began to tremble. "Did you say Mr. Brian is dead?" asked the inspector. "Yes, but I did not kill him," replied Maxwell. "I did not say you killed him," said the inspector. "But what did you put in the juice you served your brother?" Maxwell was speechless. "Why was he spitting out blood after taking the drink?" the inspector pressed. Maxwell could not answer. "Mr. Maxwell, you are under arrest for the murder of Mr. Brian, the owner of this firm who you claim to be your brother. Anything you say will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to a lawyer, and if you don't have one, the government can provide one for you." Maxwell requested to speak to his wife and informed her of his arrest. When they arrived at the station, the police requested the presence of Brian's wife. Maxwell, unable to provide her location, mentioned that his son would know where she was. Victor led the police to the place where she usually sold her goods. The officers asked around and quickly located her. "We have found the killer of your husband," they said. "Your presence is needed at the police station for the hearing as we arraign the suspect in court." Mary breathed a sigh of relief and assured them she would be present as requested. Maxwell remained in police custody until the day he was charged in court. Tina cried every day, dreading the thought of her husband going to jail and wondering where she would start anew. On the day of the judgment, everyone appeared in court. Mary arrived with her son, Victor, and Tina was present with her son as well. Maxwell's other siblings, aware of the conspiracy, were also in attendance. The case was called, and Maxwell stood at the dock. The prosecuting counsel asked numerous questions, which Maxwell could not answer. The judge then passed his judgment, finding Maxwell guilty of the murder of Mr. Brian, his alleged brother, driven by greed. Consequently, Maxwell was sentenced to life imprisonment. Tina cried out uncontrollably. The judge also declared that all of Mr. Brian's possessions should be returned to Mary and her son Victor. Mary was filled with joy as Maxwell was escorted out of the courthouse by 2 policemen. She returned to her late husband's house, which Maxwell had greedily claimed, and gave thanks to God for turning her sorrows into joy and peace. Mary also went back to the company her late husband had left behind, the same company Maxwell had coveted. While going through the files, she discovered that the gold had not been stolen but was simply misrecorded. One afternoon, Tina came to see Mary, who was sitting in the CEO's office. Mary allowed her to enter. Tina fell to her knees, begging for forgiveness. Mary assured her that she held no grudge and that Tina could come to her for help any time she needed. Mary gave her some money and let her go. What have you learned from this story? Comment below to share your thoughts.